Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for this podcast. My name is John Banja. I am a professor at the Center for Ethics at Emory University in Atlanta. And joining me today is my friend and colleague, Professor Anne-Elisabeth Courrier. Anne-Elisabeth is a visiting fellow at the Ethics Center this year. Her permanent appointment is as an associate professor in public law and comparative studies at the University of Nantes in France. And what has brought Anne-Elisabeth and me together and stimulated our idea for this podcast is a conversation that we're having because we're presently working on projects in artificial intelligence. And as Anne-Elisabeth and I were talking about issues relating to privacy, especially, we began talking about the concept of dignity. I said to Anne-Elisabeth that presently in the United States, there's an ethical conversation around the idea of dignitary harms that might be perpetrated by artificial intelligence. And as we talked more about that idea of dignity, we realized that France and the United States have some very different approaches and very different points of view as to what dignity means and how it ought to be applied and protected in particular kinds of situations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anne-Elisabeth to begin, and the way we'll begin is by giving a kind of a bird's eye view, or the view from 30,000 feet, as to how dignity plays out in our different cultures. And then we will segue into a conversation on artificial intelligence. So Anne-Elisabeth, tell us about the construct of dignity in France and on the European continent.
Thank you, John. It seems to me that dignity has been taken very seriously, especially after the Second World War, where we wanted to find some ways to deal with the history on the long term. And so we understood that dignity was full of moral obligations, but it had to be embedded in law, and especially in constitutional text, in constitutional text at the national level or at the European level, which means that today we have a full reference of constitutional documents referring to the concept of the right to respect human dignity.
Mm-hmm. And a number of countries, Germany for one, actually mentions the word dignity in their constitution.
Yes, that's right. Germany, obviously, but also Spain, also Italy, Hungary, Poland. France has not directly referred to human dignity as a wording, but the Conseil Constitutionnel in 1994 has decided that it was a principle of constitutional value. So it belongs to a block of principles which really guides all the acts and all the administrative action which could be done under this constitutional fundamental rights.
That's similar to the United States, where the word dignity does not appear in our Constitution, but it has figured prominently in some of our Supreme Court cases and in our some other documents. As a matter of fact, the President's Commission on Bioethics has used the concept of dignity a number of times. So, however, I think it's fair to say that Europe takes the concept of dignity, I believe, a lot more seriously than we do here in the United States. It is a deeply embedded construct in the European mentality, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is. You can find it in different fields and applied in different fields. So that means that you can find it in law enforcement. You can find it when you are speaking about and dealing with bioethics. You could find it in some rulings in case court. You can find it under the right of housing, giving and allowing people to keep their dignity. It's a very important reference at the constitutional level and not just as an act. And it has been introduced in primary law or in the as a construction from the rulings.
Yeah. Here in the United States, whenever people in leadership positions invoke the idea of dignity, they very, very oftentimes get pushback or criticism from their opponents. Opponents very often will criticize the opposition when they use dignity by saying, they're using dignity in a very arbitrary way. For example, charges of arbitrariness has been made against a retired Supreme Court Justice, Anthony Kennedy, who used the concept of dignity to write the majority opinion in a 2015 case that basically validated same-sex marriage in the United States, saying that married individuals or citizens in the United States have the right under dignity to choose their marital partners, irrespective of sex. On the other hand, Anthony Kennedy used the concept of dignity in the famous Hobby Lobby case in the United States, where Hobby Lobby, a corporation, wanted to deny insurance benefits to women who wanted to purchase contraceptives. Hobby Lobby said that sometimes you can use contraceptives as abortifacients. That violated the religious beliefs of leaders. And Anthony Kennedy in that decision said, those religious beliefs have dignity. Those religious beliefs are constitutive of the dignity of those leadership at Hobby Lobby, and therefore I will support their right to deny insurance benefits. The President's Commission on Bioethics about 10 years ago came out with a volume of essays on dignity in bioethics, where they use that concept. And a lot of these writers are religiously affiliated. They don't like things like assistive reproductive technologies. They don't like enhancements, biological enhancements, cognitive enhancements, because they say that there is an essence to being a human being, and tied to that essence, tied to that nature of humanness is dignity. And if you use these artificial interventions, you violate that natural, essential dignity of human beings. So the controversies here in the United States about dignity are generally centered around that it's arbitrarily used, that the idea does not come with any rules for its application. In other words, if we had rules that said, here's the situation has A, B, C, D, therefore dignity applies in that situation. Here's another situation, though it doesn't have those criteria, those elements, therefore dignity doesn't apply. That would make things a lot easier, but we don't have that kind of thing in the United States. And therefore, the criticism comes down to, look, you're in a leadership position. People can use this idea however they want to simply further their own valuative agenda. And that's kind of where the conversation stands here in the United States. I was wondering, how does it stand in France? Do you have a more solid and confident idea about applying this notion of dignity?
Yes, actually, you're right. The question is, how do we define dignity?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, through times, or depending on the context, we could find a lot of differences in how we define, and then how what is the impact of human dignity in our daily lives.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, it could be a matter of controversy. It seems that in Europe, most of the time, we have considered a difference between what is called fundamental or core dignity,
mm-hmm.
and the accurate or contextual
Mm-hmm.
dignity.
Mm-hmm.
And what are essentially referred in the constitutional text I was referring earlier is really the right to integrity of the human being.
Mm-hmm.
So we are referring and on an intrinsic and worth definition of
Right.
human dignity.
Yeah.
And when this is at stake, then the judge, the court, is able to take very different positions without any political or conservative controversy as such.
that might provide a good segue for what we were talking about in terms of
Exactly.
dignity and artificial intelligence.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
because I should tell our listeners that the way Anne-Elisabeth and I began talking about this was in the way that IT companies, data brokerage companies, data gatherers can compile lists of people, mostly for the sake of advertisements and marketing and selling goods to these individuals, that might be construed as a violation of these individuals' privacy or dignity. An example that we might use is I'm a data brokerage house and I approach a pharmaceutical company and I say, I understand that you have a new drug out for the treatment of bipolar disorder. Well, I can compile a list of people who have bipolar disorder. I can go into publicly accessible data banks. They're publicly accessible through social media and all that. And I can identify within a high degree of probability people who have bipolar disorder. I will sell you that list, and then you can send advertisements to these individuals. Well, for a lot of people, if they have psychological problems or mental illness, that's a matter of privacy to them. They don't want other people to know about it. So the question then is, and there's been some conversation about this in the United States, that perhaps the selling of this data, especially for uses or purposes that the data reference, that is to say, the subjects, the people about whom the data is, that for uses that they wouldn't want, that might constitute a dignitary harm. And of course, Anne-Elisabeth, we have the GDPR now in Europe, which is much stricter and regulates that kind of activity much more than happens in the United States. And I was wondering if you could share a few words on that with us.
Yes, obviously, the GDPR, adopted and implemented in 2018, decided that as European citizens, we should have some rights affected and related to personal data protection.
Mm-hmm.
So, especially when these data are considered as sensitive, and the examples you were giving is exactly this kind of case. Obviously, it is sensitive data, health data, or relative data, which is really important to protect. So, considered as a personal data, then we will have a special protection for it. We have to give our consent to use and to store this personal data. And if we consider that there is a breach of these rights, then there would be a possibility to get damages from it,
Mm-hmm.
and to have, especially, which seems very important to me, the right of erasure. That means that we are able and allowed to request that that a company retrieve the data and the
Right of
access.
revocation. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
This is very important to me.
So the GDPR then says you have to tell the individual how this data is going to be used.
Yeah.
And he or she must give consent, even if their data is de-identified, even if they're anonymous. They still have to consent to the possibility, for example, that your data here is going to be sold to someone, and we don't even know how it's going to be used. But that's part of the regulation. That's part of the requirement, isn't it?
Yeah, but actually, we don't want to wait until the data will be de-identified. We hope that it will be de-identified at some point, but the consent has to be done and has to be given before that, before this stage.
Oh, yes, right.
So so the question finally of de-identification is not so much important, because obviously we have given our consent or we have not. And so this should be, if we have not given our consent, it should be the end of the story.
Yeah. So therefore, I will consent to my data being de-identified, and then but I only want it to be used in this particular way, but not that particular way. Or you can use it however you want, or you can sell it, or no, I don't want you to sell it. So, I mean, all of these kinds of consents that data reference and data subjects go through, I mean, that's codified there in the GDPR, right?
Yes, and it is very important to note that there is a responsibility, a huge accountability process for the companies. And above these companies, we have national regulatory authorities, which are in charge with checking and helping the citizens
Mm-hmm.
to get help, yes, to have possibilities to see this right fully respected.
Right.
And then there is European authorities as well. I mean, I'm speaking about the European Union as such. So we, at different levels, national and European, we have a full framework of authorities and so text and authorities which can ensure the efficiency of the system.
Right. And it's important for United States businesses to know that if they're going to do business in Europe, they have to comply with the GDPR. And
Yes.
again, those compliances can be a lot more strict, and they are a lot more strict than here in the United States.
Correct.
By the way, that's another thing that we could talk about, Anne-Elisabeth, because we have been having this conversation. Talk a little bit. Right now, we are in a very anti-regulatory climate here in the United States. We don't want to pose limitations on businesses in terms of their growth, their profit seeking, and all that kind of stuff, especially this current administration. However, Europe is much, much more regulatorily inclined than we are here. Isn't that the case?
Yes, it is indeed. In France, I mean, in France and in Europe, we have a culture. I mean, having spent a lot of time in Europe and quite some time in the US, I can see the differences between the two cultures, difference of approaches. And obviously, in Europe, we have a much more regulatory influence and state of mind, which might be really good in respect to the client or to the customer or to the citizen, but which might also be seen as an obstacle, an impediment for businesses,
yes,
because
right.
at some point we have, and we don't want to lose some markets and parts of the markets which could be very important in terms of IT. Mm-hmm. And so it seems to me that we were speaking about the GDPR, but coming back to AI, to artificial intelligence, it seems to me that Dignity might be quite a good reference as well, especially by the fact that the high-level expert group on artificial intelligence in 2019 made a guidelines, an ethics guideline for trustworthy AI, in which they were considering that dignity and fundamental rights should be as a background, and should be conceived as a background for setting all the different ways of and framework for developing AI.
Yeah.
And so, for example, and it's very interesting to go back to it, because you were referring as to a definition of dignity, which was understood as referring to human autonomy. Mm-hmm. And in fact, in 2019, as in 2020, the European Commission has considered that human oversight, human agency, human autonomy should be at the heart, at the core framework of developing AI in Europe.
I very much like the tying in the notion of trustworthiness, though, into this entire conversation about privacy, about autonomy, about dignity, because clearly, if I am a consumer and I don't trust your company, I'm not going to do business with you. And, to the extent this might open up a kind of a back door where businesses start thinking more about the dignity of consumers, because if I violate your dignity, well, then this is not going to be good for my company. So whether or not an individual has a principled interest in dignity as such, or whether he or she simply sees it as an important means to achieve the aspirations, the profit aspirations of that particular company, what I'm trying to say is I have a hunch in the United States, we are going to look more and more to the sensibilities of something like the GDPR. And my prediction is that whether by regulation or legislation or simply by choice, more and more companies are going to respect human dignity in the years to come, the next 5 to 10 years, precisely because they value the importance of customer trust in their corporate dealings and practices.
Yeah, I share this point because it seems to me that at some point we would have to either by tort or by act or by regulatory framework, but also by corporate social responsibility. Mm-hmm. At some point, the industries, as you said, will be in a position where to keep relationship and business with their clients, they will have to recognize that it is important to have to be in a trusty relationship with the client, and that at some point it has to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
As through the channel of human autonomy. Yeah. Human injustice, human oversight.
And so often privacy and autonomy can be proxies for dignity. But as I sit here right now and talk to you about this, I'm kind of feeling a certain confidence that, dignity may come back into the conversation as being a very, very, very important value, whether you like it or not, a very important value in how civilizations, Western civilizations, move forward in this informational age.
Yeah.
Where so much is known about us, and it has to be used in ways that don't violate fundamental rights and, again, dignity.
Yeah, exactly. I do agree with that. It seems to me that we cannot be exposed in public, and so we might see different definition or acceptations of the concept of dignity, but at some point it will be the same spirit, the same idea. We still have to be in control of our who we are.
Indeed. Well, Anne-Elisabeth, thank you very, very much for this conversation. I enjoyed it a great deal. I hope our viewers did too. Thanks to you all for tuning in, and we look forward to doing more of these kinds of conversations.
Thank you to you. Thanks to you, John. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye now. Bye.